July 1944. Across the Pacific, the war that had once seemed unstoppable for Imperial Japan was collapsing in on itself. American forces were advancing island by island, cutting supply lines, bombing airfields, and tightening a ring of steel around territories that had once flown the rising sun without challenge. Saipan had fallen. Guam was under assault. Leyte was on the horizon. For many Japanese civilians and auxiliary personnel stationed in contested zones, the promise of imperial victory was dissolving into smoke. For years they had been told a story, that the enemy was barbaric, that surrender was dishonor, that capture meant torture, humiliation, or worse. Propaganda leaflets, military briefings, whispered rumors, all reinforced the same message: better death than capture. In both Japan and occupied territories, fear of American forces was carefully cultivated. It was not simply military fear, it was existential. Among those caught in the chaos was a young Japanese woman assigned as an auxiliary support worker near a strategic island outpost in the Pacific. She was not a frontline soldier. She carried no rifle into battle. Her duties were logistical, assisting with supplies, clerical tasks, and occasional nursing support for wounded personnel. Like many women mobilized in the later years of the war, she had been drawn into service as Japan's manpower shortages grew critical. By mid-1944, the illusion of stability was gone. American naval bombardment shook the island day and night. The sky no longer belonged to Japan. Planes roared overhead with mechanical certainty, dropping explosives that tore into bunkers, runways, and supply depots. Food grew scarce, medical supplies dwindled, communication lines fractured. Civilians and auxiliaries were ordered to assist in defensive preparations. Trenches were dug, caves were converted into makeshift shelters. Instructions circulated: if the enemy breaks through, you know what to do. No one said the words clearly, but everyone understood. When the American landing finally came, it was overwhelming. Amphibious vehicles crawled toward shore under covering fire. Artillery thundered inland. Japanese defensive positions, already weakened, began to collapse under coordinated assault. Some units fought to the last. Others scattered into jungle and cave systems. She fled with a small group toward the interior, carrying only what she could manage. For days they hid, moving at night, surviving on minimal rations. The sounds of battle shifted farther away, then closer again. Rumors spread among those in hiding. American patrols were combing the island. Prisoners were being taken. Fear intensified. Stories circulated of atrocities, many exaggerated, some entirely fabricated by wartime propaganda. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Was capture worse than death? Could surrender even be trusted? Imperial doctrine had left little room for such questions. Eventually, exhaustion made decisions for them. Dehydration, hunger, and the psychological strain of constant hiding broke the group's resolve. When American soldiers discovered their position near a rocky ravine, there was no dramatic last stand, no final charge, only trembling hands and stunned silence. The moment of capture did not match the nightmare she had imagined. The American soldiers shouted commands, weapons raised, but they did not fire. A translator, likely a Nisei soldier serving in U.S. intelligence, attempted broken Japanese phrases, urging calm. Hands were checked for weapons. The group was searched quickly but methodically. No immediate violence followed. She had expected rage. Instead, she encountered procedure. Still, fear did not fade. It deepened in a different way. The unknown can be more terrifying than the imagined. If this was not immediate brutality, what came next? They were escorted to a temporary American field detention area not far from the secured shoreline. It was not a permanent POW camp with barbed wire towers stretching endlessly. It was improvised: tents, Medical stations, supply crates stacked in neat rows, armed guards rotating watch. The war was still active, infrastructure was temporary and pragmatic. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed, names recorded when possible, basic medical inspections performed. For many Japanese captives in 1944 to 1945, this initial screening was their first close contact with Americans outside of combat. She watched carefully, observed everything. The Americans seemed loud, informal, almost careless compared to the rigid discipline she had known. Some smoked casually on duty, others joked among themselves. It felt alien. Then came something even more disorienting. Water was distributed. Canteens passed down the line, not withheld, not rationed as punishment, simply given. Some prisoners hesitated, suspecting deception. Was it contaminated? A trick? But thirst overruled suspicion. She drank cautiously. Nothing happened. No cruelty followed. Later, basic rations were provided. Plain food, unfamiliar in taste, but edible. No one forced them to bow. No one demanded declarations. Cards maintained distance, but there was no immediate humiliation ritual, no spectacle. This contradiction unsettled her more than brutality might have. For years, the enemy had been described as monstrous, yet here they were, human, structured, operating under rules she did not understand. It did not erase fear, it complicated it. At night, inside the temporary enclosure, whispers moved through the detainees. Some insisted this kindness was temporary, that interrogation or abuse would follow. Others wondered if perhaps surrender did not mean annihilation after all. No one knew what to believe. She lay awake, replaying every warning she had ever heard. In her mind, capture was spiritual contamination as much as physical defeat. To be taken alive carried shame, not just personal, but ancestral. What would her family think if they knew? Would they even know? In the days that followed, cultural differences became sharper. American medics examined prisoners for wounds and illness. Some Japanese detainees recoiled at physical contact. Modesty codes and social norms clashed with clinical efficiency. Instructions barked in English sounded harsh, even when intentions were neutral. She felt suspended between two collapsing worlds. The empire she had trusted was falling. The enemy she had feared did not behave as expected. Survival now depended on navigating a reality no one had prepared her for. Suspicion lingered in every interaction. Every gesture from a guard was analyzed. Every offer of assistance questioned. Was this strategy, psychological warfare, or simply the mundane mechanics of wartime captivity? The Pacific War in 1944 was defined by brutality on both sides. Yet within that brutality existed moments of procedural humanity, shaped not by sentiment, but military policy and international conventions that the United States, at least formally, adhered to regarding prisoners of war. She did not know the Geneva Conventions, she only knew confusion. And beneath that confusion was a growing realization: she was alive. Not dead in a cave, not executed on the beach, not abandoned in the jungle. Alive, in the custody of the very people she had been taught to fear most. But survival brought its own uncertainty. What would captivity mean? How long would the war last? What would happen if Japan surrendered? Would she ever see home again? As American aircraft continued to roar overhead and distant artillery echoed across the island, one chapter of her life had ended. The empire's promise of invincibility had crumbled. In its place stood barbed wire, foreign voices, and the uneasy possibility that everything she believed about the enemy might be incomplete. And in that fragile space between fear and reality, the true test of survival was only beginning. By late summer of 1944, the front lines had shifted, but the war was far from over. The temporary field enclosure where she was first processed gradually gave way to a more organized holding area.
As American forces consolidated control over the island, detainees were transferred to a structured prisoner compound, still provisional, still surrounded by war, but more stable than the chaos of initial capture. Barbed wire defined the perimeter. Guard towers overlooked rows of canvas tents. Inside, order replaced panic. Names were logged more carefully. Medical tags were issued. Rations were distributed on schedule. It was not comfort, it was system. For her, the first days inside the wire were the most disorienting, not because of violence, but because of routine. She had expected interrogation rooms, shouting officers, punishment for surrender. Instead, she encountered something colder and more unsettling: administration. Each morning began with roll call. Prisoners stood in uneven lines as guards counted and recounted. Translators relayed instructions. Movements were regulated: latrine times, water access, meal distribution. Even captivity had structure. Yet beneath the surface order, tension never disappeared. Many of the women held in the compound were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Some had served as clerks, radio assistants, factory workers relocated to island installations, or volunteer nursing aides. As Japan's manpower reserves shrank in 1944-1945, civilian mobilization blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant. When American forces overran strategic islands, those distinctions often vanished in the smoke of battle. Inside the compound, hierarchy quietly reformed among the detainees. Older women asserted authority. Former military nurses organized sleeping spaces with disciplined precision. Rumors circulated constantly about other islands, about the emperor, about supposed American intentions. One rumor returned again and again: Americans could not be trusted. Kindness was manipulation. Medical care was experimentation. Food was bait. Propaganda had not disappeared simply because the guns had quieted nearby. Medical inspections became a defining feature of camp life. American medics moved through the compound regularly, checking for infections, malnutrition, untreated wounds. Tropical environments were unforgiving. Dysentery, malaria, skin infections, and respiratory illness spread quickly in confined populations weakened by stress and poor diet. She tried to avoid eye contact during these examinations. Physical touch from a foreign man, even a doctor, carried deep cultural discomfort. In pre-war Japan, modesty and gender boundaries were strictly observed. Now, survival required submitting to foreign hands checking pulse, lifting eyelids, examining injuries. The first time a medic pressed a stethoscope to her back, she froze, not because of pain, but because of what it symbolized. Her body, once protected by nation, family, and custom, now existed inside enemy territory, governed by enemy rules. And yet, the medic's movements were clinical, detached. He was not studying her as a trophy of war. He was listening for fluid in her lungs. The contradiction gnawed at her certainty. Daily meals followed predictable patterns: powdered eggs, canned meat, rice when available through captured stores, occasionally unfamiliar items from American rations. It was not abundant, but compared to the starvation conditions many Japanese garrisons faced in late 1944, it was stable. Some prisoners refused certain foods at first, convinced contamination or spiritual impurity might be involved. Others ate immediately, hunger overriding ideology. She ate slowly, carefully, aware of the eyes of other detainees watching for signs of weakness or disloyalty. Conversations often drifted toward honor, toward shame, toward what it meant to have survived capture. Imperial doctrine had long emphasized death before surrender, yet here they were, breathing, eating, sleeping under guard. Was survival betrayal or instinct? At night, distant artillery flashes still lit the horizon. The Pacific War was not abstract, it was audible. American bombers continued sorties toward other Japanese-held positions. Ships anchored offshore, silhouettes against the moonlit water. Inside the compound, whispers softened. Exhaustion replaced outrage. Fear evolved into something more complicated. Uncertainty layered with reluctant curiosity. One afternoon, a commotion rippled through the women's section of the camp. A detainee had collapsed during roll call. Heat exhaustion, possibly infection. American medics responded quickly, kneeling beside her, assessing pulse and breathing. An IV kit was brought forward. The sight of foreign medical equipment unsettled many of the prisoners. Clear tubes, glass bottles, metal instruments that gleamed under harsh tropical light. She watched from a distance as fluid flowed through the line into the unconscious woman's arm. No harm followed. The patient's breathing steadied. She was carried gently to the medical tent for monitoring. It was the first time she had witnessed American medical intervention up close. In Japan during the war, blood transfusion techniques were known, but not widespread in front-line or remote island settings due to supply limitations. Plasma preservation and whole blood transfusions were advancing rapidly within American medical medicine by 1944, supported by organized blood donation drives back home. The U.S. military had developed systems for storing and transporting plasma efficiently across the Pacific theater. She did not know these logistical facts. She only saw foreign liquid entering a Japanese body, and that body surviving. Among the detainees, interpretations varied wildly. Some claimed it was proof of American arrogance. They believed they could control life itself. Others whispered that accepting enemy blood would corrupt the spirit. Blood, in Japanese cultural understanding, carried deep symbolic weight. It was lineage, family continuity, an invisible thread connecting ancestors to descendants. To imagine foreign blood entering one's veins was not merely medical, it was metaphysical. These beliefs were not universal nor officially codified, but in times of war, symbolism grows stronger. As days passed, illness crept quietly through sections of the camp. Malnutrition from months prior to capture weakened immune systems. Minor wounds festered in tropical humidity. Psychological stress manifested physically. Fainting spells, fevers with no clear infection source, persistent fatigue. She began to feel it too. At first, it was subtle. Dizziness upon standing, a chill at night despite the heat. She attributed it to exhaustion, to nerves. But when her hands trembled in morning roll call, she felt something deeper shifting. The American medics noticed patterns before the prisoners did. Records were kept, temperatures logged, symptoms tracked. Efficiency did not equal warmth, but it did mean attention. One evening, as monsoon clouds gathered low and heavy, rain began to pound the canvas roofs of the tents. The compound transformed into mud and shadow. Water pooled along pathways. Thunder rolled across the island. Inside her tent, she lay awake listening to the storm and the uneven breathing of the women beside her. For the first time since capture, fear shifted direction. It was no longer solely about what Americans might do. It was about what her own body might fail to do. The empire had crumbled. The propaganda had fractured. Now something more intimate loomed. Fragility from within. Outside, under the dim light of a guarded lantern, American medics prepared supplies for another night of examinations. They did not see enemies lying under those tents. They saw patients, cases to stabilize, infections to contain, dehydration to treat. Two systems of belief existed within the same fence, one rooted in national loyalty and inherited warnings, the other in wartime medical protocol and battlefield necessity. Neither fully understood the other, and as her strength quietly declined, those two worlds were moving toward a collision neither side anticipated.
The fever came without warning. One morning she woke with a heaviness in her limbs that felt different from ordinary fatigue. Her vision blurred when she tried to sit up. The air inside the tent felt thick, unbreathable. By roll call, she was swaying where she stood. A guard noticed first. Then one of the American medics stepped forward, gesturing for her to sit. She resisted out of reflex, embarrassed by the attention, but the ground rushed upward before she could decide. When she regained awareness, She was lying on a cot inside the camp's medical tent. The canvas walls snapped in the wind. A lantern hung from a central pole, casting long shadows over metal instruments arranged with quiet precision. The smell of antiseptic mixed with damp earth. A thermometer rested beneath her tongue. Fingers pressed lightly against her wrist, counting. The medic exchanged a look with another attendant. Even without understanding English, she recognized concern. Her fever was high, her pulse weak, and beneath the surface symptoms lay something more dangerous, severe anemia, likely worsened by malnutrition and possibly internal blood loss from an untreated infection. Months of scarcity before capture had already drained her strength. Now her body was failing under compounded stress. In the Pacific Theater during 1944-1945, American field hospitals had become increasingly adept at rapid stabilization. The U.S. military's blood banking system, pioneered earlier in the war, allowed whole blood and plasma to be transported across oceans in refrigerated containers. On major operations, forward medical units could perform transfusions that would have been logistically impossible only a few years earlier. But here, inside a prisoner compound on a recently secured island, supplies were limited. The medics evaluated options quickly. She drifted in and out of consciousness as discussion unfolded around her. A translator was called. Words filtered through slowly, fragmented by fever. "You are very weak. Your blood is low. We can help." The translator hesitated before delivering the final part. "They may need to give you blood." For a moment, the fever seemed to vanish, replaced by sharp, cold clarity. Blood. The word struck deeper than any diagnosis. In her understanding, blood was not interchangeable fluid. It was heritage. It carried the essence of one's family line. To mix blood was to blur identity. Wartime rhetoric had reinforced the concept of purity, racial, national, spiritual. To receive enemy blood was unthinkable. Her breathing quickened. She tried to sit up, pulling weakly at the thin blanket. "No," she whispered hoarsely. The translator repeated the explanation gently. Without intervention, her condition could worsen. She might not survive the week. Around her, other detainees watched from the tent entrance, eyes wide. Some shook their heads urgently. Others looked away, unwilling to witness what they believed would be spiritual violation. The medic stepped closer, kneeling so his face was level with hers. His expression was steady, clinical, but not unkind. He did not see ideology. He saw dangerously low hemoglobin levels, unstable pulse, a patient on the edge. He gestured toward his own arm, miming the process. Blood flows, body recovers, simple. But nothing about it felt simple. Propaganda resurfaced in her mind like a tide. Americans were cruel. Americans were barbaric. Americans would contaminate the Japanese spirit. Better death than dishonor. Yet death was no longer abstract. It pulsed in her temples. It trembled in her fingertips. The camp physician made the decision. Without transfusion, her survival chances were slim. With it, significantly improved. The challenge was compatibility. By 1944, blood typing, A-B-A-B-O, was standard practice in American medical practice. Quick cross-matching procedures were used even in field conditions. A medic checked her blood type using available testing reagents. O-type blood, the universal donor for whole blood transfusion in emergencies, was limited but present in storage. The irony was silent but profound. In the American system, blood was categorized scientifically by antigens and plasma compatibility, not by nationality. To her, it was still enemy blood. As preparations began, panic overtook her fragile strength. She tried to pull the needle away before it was even inserted. Tears mixed with fever sweat.
She spoke rapidly in Japanese, voice breaking, about ancestors, about shame, about what this would mean. The translator struggled to keep pace. She says she cannot carry American blood. She says it will change her. The medic paused. In that moment, the war condensed into a single question. What does blood represent? To him, it was oxygen transport, volume replacement, a measurable solution to a measurable problem. To her, it was identity. Outside, rain began again, drumming against canvas like distant artillery. Inside the tent, time felt suspended. The physician made a quiet adjustment. He ordered that the explanation be tried again, slower, clearer. The translator leaned close. "Blood does not change who you are," he said carefully. "It helps your body fight. It does not carry nationality." She stared at the glass bottle suspended from a metal stand, dark red, almost black in lantern light. "Whose?" she asked faintly. "An American soldier's donation, stored for emergency use. Someone she had never met, someone who might still be fighting on another island, someone who likely believed he was aiding a fellow American." The complexity of it all pressed down on her. If she refused, she might die. If she accepted, she feared becoming something else, neither fully Japanese in spirit nor free from the mark of the enemy. Around the tent, silence deepened. Even the other detainees sensed the weight of the decision. This was no longer simply medical, it was symbolic. The medic inserted the needle gently into her arm, waiting for her final resistance. Her muscles tensed, but did not pull away. The first drops began to travel down the narrow tube. Her breathing turned shallow, eyes fixed on the line connecting bottle to vein. She seemed to search for immediate transformation, some internal shift, some sign that identity was dissolving. Nothing happened. No sudden vision, no violent reaction, only the slow rhythm of transfusion. But panic does not obey reason. Midway through the procedure, she gasped sharply, clutching at her chest. The translator leaned in urgently. "Your blood, in me?" she whispered, voice trembling between accusation and disbelief. The medic held her gaze steadily. "Yes," the translator said softly, "to keep you alive." Inside that fragile exchange lay the collision of two worlds, science and symbolism, war and humanity, fear and survival. The transfusion continued under careful watch, pulse monitored, temperature checked, any sign of rejection observed, but her body, indifferent to ideology, responded to biology. Color slowly returned to her lips. The fever did not vanish instantly, but her pulse steadied. The tremor in her hands eased. The enemy blood, if that was what it must be called, was doing what blood does, carrying oxygen, sustaining life. Outside the medical tent, word spread quickly among the detainees. Some viewed it as necessary survival, others as irreversible contamination. A few watched the tent with silent, conflicted awe. Inside the tent, she lay exhausted, tears drying against her temples, unsure whether she had betrayed her country or simply chosen to live. The war still raged across the Pacific. Ships still burned. Soldiers still charged beaches under fire. But in this small canvas tent, another kind of battle had unfolded. One fought not with artillery, but with belief. And as the last measured drops emptied from the bottle into her vein, the question lingered heavier than ever. If blood does not choose a flag, then what truly divides enemies?
The transfusion did not end the struggle, it only transformed it. Through the night, she drifted between shallow sleep and uneasy awareness. Every sensation felt magnified. The beat of her heart sounded foreign in her ears, as if it carried an unfamiliar rhythm.
She flexed her fingers slowly, half expecting them to feel different, stronger, weaker, altered in some invisible way. But they were simply her hands. The medical tent was quieter now. The storm had passed. Only the occasional murmur of English voices drifted in from outside. A lantern burned low near her cot. The glass bottle that had hung above her was gone, replaced with a simple bandage wrapped around her arm. She stared at it for a long time. In her mind, the act could not be undone. Whatever had entered her body now moved through her veins. The boundary she had believed sacred, Japanese blood, Japanese spirit, had been crossed. When the translator returned in the morning, she turned her face away at first. Shame pressed heavier than fever. She expected condemnation from the other detainees, whispered judgment, silent exclusion. But what she saw when she was helped to sit up surprised her. Curiosity. Some women avoided her gaze, uncertain how to process what had happened, but others leaned closer, searching her face for signs of change. Was she different? Did she look the same? Did something in her eyes reveal transformation? She looked back at them steadily. "I am alive," she said quietly. The words carried more weight than she intended. Outside the tent, the American medic who had overseen the procedure stood reviewing notes with another corpsman. He had not slept much. For him, the transfusion had been routine in principle, but complicated in execution. Not medically complicated, culturally. He had seen combat casualties with less resistance, men screaming from shrapnel wounds who begged for blood without question. Yet this young woman had fought the needle with an intensity rooted not in pain, but in belief. He asked the translator something simple. "Does she understand why we did it?" The translator hesitated. Understanding, he knew, was not immediate. It was layered. "She understands you wanted to save her, but what it means, that may take time." By afternoon, her strength had improved enough for her to step outside the tent with assistance. The sunlight felt sharp against her eyes. The camp looked unchanged, barbed wire, watchtowers, distant ocean glinting beyond military vehicles parked in precise rows. Yet everything felt altered. She moved slowly along the edge of the compound, aware of her own heartbeat. She waited for some inner voice to accuse her, to declare impurity, to confirm the propaganda she had absorbed since youth. Nothing came. Instead, she felt something far more destabilizing, confusion giving way to doubt. If the Americans were truly monsters, why had they given blood freely? Why risk precious medical supplies on a prisoner? Why explain the procedure at all? Wartime narratives thrive on simplicity, good and evil, honor and disgrace, us and them, but survival blurs those lines. Later that evening, she requested to speak with the translator again. The request itself required courage. To initiate conversation with the enemy carried social risk within the compound. When he arrived, she asked the question that had been circling her mind since the transfusion began. Whose blood was it? The translator relayed the question to the medic. He responded without ceremony. A volunteer donor, an American soldier, donated before deployment. The idea unsettled her in a new way. The blood had not been taken in violence. It had been offered voluntarily, stored for someone wounded in battle. "Does he know?" she asked softly. The medic headed his head. Donors were not told where their blood would go. It could save a Marine on a beach, a pilot pulled from the sea, or, in this case, a Japanese prisoner. She absorbed that silently. For the first time, the abstraction of enemy fractured into an individual. Somewhere, a young American man had rolled up his sleeve, perhaps joking with fellow soldiers, unaware that his blood would cross the very boundaries war insisted were absolute. The translator, sensing the weight of the moment, added gently, "Blood is just blood. It carries life. It does not carry hatred." She did not answer immediately. Years of conditioning do not dissolve in a single conversation, but something shifted. Not allegiance, not identity, but rigidity. In the days that followed, her recovery became visible. Her color returned. She could stand without assistance. Her appetite improved. The camp physician noted stabilization in her vital signs. Other detainees began to approach her quietly at night, asking what it felt like. Did she sense anything foreign inside her? Did her thoughts change? Did dreams come differently? She searched honestly for an answer. It felt like dying, and then it felt like breathing again. That was all. The simplicity of her response carried more power than argument. Meanwhile, the American medic found himself reflecting more than he expected. He had treated countless wounded soldiers. He had followed protocol, but this encounter lingered. War required dehumanization to function efficiently, yet medicine resisted that instinct. A medic could not ask a body about ideology before stopping the bleeding. In the fragile space of the prisoner camp, two truths had collided. One side believed blood defined belonging. The other believed blood was universal tissue. Neither had intended to challenge the other's worldview, yet the challenge had occurred anyway. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in muted orange, she stood near the wire fence watching the ocean. Beyond it lay uncertainty. Defeat for Japan seemed increasingly inevitable by late 1944. American naval power dominated the Pacific. Rumors of new offensives spread even within the camp. She placed her hand lightly over the bandaged spot on her arm. The blood moving beneath her skin did not feel American. It did not feel Japanese. It felt warm, steady, alive. The war still divided nations. Soldiers still fought with ferocity. Cities would still burn before peace arrived. But inside her body flowed proof of something inconvenient to hatred. Survival did not recognize flags. When she finally turned away from the fence and walked back towards the tents, her steps were firmer than before. Not because she had abandoned who she was, but because she had confronted the fear that identity could be erased by compassion. And in surviving that fear, something stronger than propaganda had taken root. Not loyalty to an enemy, but the unsettling realization that humanity could exist even where war insisted it should not. By early 1945, the sound of war began to change. Inside the camp, the rhythm of daily life remained structured: roll calls, medical checks, ration lines, but the distant thunder of artillery grew less frequent. American forces had pushed farther across the Pacific. Island strongholds that once seemed unbreakable had fallen, one by one. The inevitability of Japan's strategic collapse was no longer a rumor whispered in tents. It was a quiet understanding settling over both guards and prisoners. She felt stronger now. The fever had not returned. Her pulse was steady. The weakness that once forced her to cling to tent poles for balance had faded into memory. Yet the mark on her arm, the small scar where the needle had entered, remained visible. It became a private symbol. Among the detainees, conversation shifted as news filtered in. Some information came through official announcements, translated by camp staff. Other fragments drifted through casual remarks from guards who did not realize how closely they were being listened to. American bombers had intensified raids over the Japanese mainland. Major cities were suffering devastating air attacks. Supply lines were shattered. Naval dominance was unquestioned. For many prisoners, this knowledge carried a painful duality. They were physically safe compared to countless civilians in Japan, yet powerless to protect their families from what might be unfolding at home. She often found herself sitting quietly at dusk, imagining her mother listening to distant sirens, wondering whether her daughter was alive or dead.
In Japan's wartime culture, families of those captured rarely received confirmation. Silence often meant the worst. Inside the compound, treatment remained consistent. The United States, despite the brutality of Pacific combat, generally adhered to formal prisoner-of-war policies under the Geneva Convention, at least in structured detention systems. Food was rationed but distributed. Medical care continued. Discipline was firm but procedural. It did not erase the violence of the broader war, but it complicated the narrative she had once believed absolute. In August 1945, the atmosphere inside the camp shifted abruptly. Guards appeared tense but not aggressive. Officers gathered in discussion more frequently. Radios crackled with urgency. Something decisive had happened. Then came the announcement. Japan had surrendered. The emperor's voice, broadcast across the empire in a historic radio address, declared acceptance of Allied terms. For many Japanese citizens, it was the first time hearing him speak directly. For prisoners held abroad, the news arrived through translated summaries delivered by camp officials. She listened as the translator relayed the message. The war was over. No cheers erupted in the women's compound. There was no celebration, only stunned silence. For years, surrender had been framed as unthinkable. Now it was reality. Some detainees wept quietly. Others stared at the ground, processing the collapse not only of military power, but of ideology. The empire that had promised endurance beyond surrender had yielded. She felt something unexpected. Relief. Not triumph, not humiliation. Relief that the constant tension, the waiting for the next bombardment, the next assault, the next escalation, had ended. Within weeks, preparations for repatriation began. Paperwork was processed, health evaluations conducted. Prisoners were grouped for transport back to Japan under Allied supervision. Before departure, she requested one final conversation with the translator, and through him, the medic who had overseen her transfusion months earlier. The meeting was brief, informal. There were no grand speeches. She bowed slightly, not deeply, but deliberately. "Thank you," she said. The translator conveyed the words. The medic nodded once, almost awkwardly. He had not considered himself part of her story beyond that moment in the tent. To him, it had been one patient among many. But to her, it had marked a fracture in certainty that would never fully close. When transport day arrived, detainees were escorted to waiting ships under guard, not as enemies now, but as former combatants being returned home. The Pacific horizon stretched wide and quiet, no longer lit by artillery. On the voyage back towards a devastated Japan, she stood at the railing and felt the steady pulse within her chest. It did not feel foreign. It felt human. Repatriation was not simple. Japan in late 1945 was a nation transformed, cities scarred by bombing, infrastructure shattered, millions displaced. Returning prisoners often faced complicated emotions, relief at survival, mixed with shame, silence, or misunderstanding from communities conditioned by wartime expectations. She did not speak openly about the transfusion, not at first. How could she explain that survival had come through the veins of someone she had been taught to hate, that the enemy's blood had not erased her identity, but preserved it? Years passed, reconstruction began, new narratives replaced old propaganda. The war became history rather than immediacy. But sometimes, in quiet moments, she would touch the faint scar on her arm and remember the lantern-lit tent, the glass bottle suspended overhead, the translator's careful voice, the question that had trembled from her lips. "Your blood in me?" The answer, she now understood, had never been about nationality. Blood did not choose a flag. It did not carry ideology. It carried oxygen, warmth, continuity. War had taught her fear. Capture had taught her uncertainty. Survival had taught her something more enduring, that humanity can appear in the least expected places, even inside the machinery of conflict.